Hi, I'm Chuck Firlotte, and welcome to Heart, a podcast series on leadership brought to you from the Welch College of Business and Technology at beautiful Sacred Heart University.
Chuck Firlotte is a successful business executive, a guy who's worked very hard to get to where he is, emphasizes learning, taking care of people, and always meeting his responsibilities. He's actually a great role model for someone who wants to grow in their career. Has always wanted to do more, grow more, and make a greater contribution. And he's never ending. And you're going to have to nail his coffin shut when he dies, because he's going to want to do one more deal, for sure.
Greetings, folks. I'm Chuck Firlotte, and I'm with you today from the beautiful campus of Sacred Heart University. Welcome to Heart, a not too subtle play on the name of the school. And it's all about leadership. And today I have with me Ted Mann and Tom Gryta, authors of Lights Out, Pride, Delusion, and the Fall of General Electric. Ted and Tom, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
You're both writers, former Wall Street Journal guys, writers, authors. Tell me a little bit about that trajectory before we get into the story of General Electric, which is a fascinating book, endorsed by Bill Gates. How did your journey in writing begin? Tom?
Yeah. I always enjoyed writing, honestly, as a young boy. Through college, I studied history, came out of college, and initially, my first big career decision was to work in a bar. I was a cook, and I saved up money, and I actually moved to London, and got a entry level, basically almost like an internship at Dow Jones Newswires. And I started at the Newswires, worked there for almost a year in London. Couldn't get a visa because, for obvious reasons, I was entry level. Came back to the US, worked for another company briefly, and then went back to the Newswires. Was there for several years before
in
moving.
England as well?
No, I was in New York at that point. And I worked at the Newswires, covering pharmaceuticals and biotechnology companies, and then did a fellowship at Columbia for a year, came back and joined the Journal. I was covering telecommunications for about 5 years, and then after that moved on to cover General Electric.
What era was that, Tom? What era? What generally?
We're talking about that. What I just described is basically like 15 years of I was covering pharma for about 5 years, covered telecom for about 5 years. Was doing other stuff before that for a good 5 years, and then I moved into covering General Electric, but it was industrials. I was covering the industrial beat. And it was described to me as like, mostly General Electric, but, a lot of other companies. And, for me, it quickly became only General Electric.
Fascinating. So who was at the helm? Who was in the corner office in Fairfield when you began?
Jeff Immelt.
So it was Jeff.
Yes. And it was his succession was announced a few months after I took over, from the previous person who covered GE, but I can't remember who that was.
He was great though.
Yeah, so I took over for Ted. It was, and it actually was, as we all know, General Electric is like the definition of complexity. It was not easy to just jump in and cover it. So Ted and I worked a lot at the beginning to sort of hand over the reins. But as things really heated up with General Electric, Ted never really walked away. We collaborated a lot on stuff, and that is how we got here, as far as writing the book together and all of that.
So an account of that size, if I can call it an account from a writer's perspective, would be all-consuming, big, international, huge, correct?
Yes, sprawling.
Correct.
And
very complicated, very, very complicated.
Intentionally complicated. Yes.
Complicated, which we'll get into. Ted, how did you begin?
Where did I come
in
from?
your career?
I worked at the college paper when I was in college. I spent most of my time there, and then did not know what to do with myself after I graduated, and eventually realized I was going to just be on couches forever if I didn't get a job. So the first place that would offer me one was a little newspaper called the New London Day in Connecticut, where weirdly my father had worked for like 8 months in the 70s, and he was also a journalist, and a friend of his had become the publisher. So I think he pulled a string to get me the interview. So I started there, and I covered 3 towns with a combined population of like 3,000 people when I started. But the State House job was open, I think, because no one with seniority wanted to drive to Hartford every day. And the governor was under federal investigation. So I just said, I'll do it. And then lo and behold, I was the State House reporter there for at least, I think, 7 years or so. I stayed far longer than I intended. This is one of those periods in journalism that's like the kind of like the end of Fight Club. Like all the papers I would have gone to were collapsing under their own weight. So I just stayed in New London. And I had a great time there, but eventually got ready to do something else. I quit and spent a year freelancing, writing a profile of a guy who'd just been elected governor there, Dan Malloy. And then when that was over, I really had no idea what to do with myself. And my friend Mike, who I'd worked with on college paper with, had become an editor at the Journal in what was then called the Greater New York section, essentially a metro section at the Journal. And they kind of snuck me in the side door. And so I came to New York, and I covered transportation in the city. I wrote about the Port Authority and the MTA and taxis and all that good stuff. And then after a couple of years, I had been just chatting in the hallway with 2 editors, Drew Dowell and Kate Linebaugh, who preceded me on the GE beat. And they convinced me that I ought to apply for it. And I started knowing nothing about corporations, about how to cover them. But it just seemed, as you said, it seemed like such a great beat because the company was so big and complicated and politically active and just sprawling. And so they let me take a stab at it. So I did that for a few years and had to move to Washington for family reasons. And that's when I passed the beat to Tom. But as he was saying, that period was one in which the transitions were coming so fast that we sort of wound up collaborating, and we never really stopped until the book.
So it was the moving out of Jack Welch and the moving in of
Welch.
Jeff
Welch was
Immelt.
long gone I should say Welch physically was long gone by the time I was covering the company. The ghost was the sort of anxiety of influence that defines Immelt's career. But yeah, Immelt was the CEO the entire time I covered them.
Got it. So your predecessors would have been there when Welch was.
The guy who was the editor-in-chief for a period of time when we were at the Journal, Matt Murray, had been the beat reporter at the GE beat reporter at the end of the Welch era. He has clips from all of the great juicy Welch divorce saga. Like Matt was on those. So when we got a chance to chat with him about the company, he had a lot of, he remembered the glory days.
So you're both collaborating, if you will. It's the handover from one to the other, from Ted to Tom. At what point did you say, there's a great book here?
I actually have a very clear memory of this because I was on paternity leave, and I think I'd finally gotten my son to take a nap. And Tom and I were on the phone, and I had just been sort of climbing the walls and was thinking maybe there is a book here. And we had a brief conversation about whether it would be a good idea and if we should do it together. And I think, Tom, correct me if I'm wrong, shortly after that conversation, I found out from you that there was this idea within the journal of doing essentially a big heave of a project on what had happened to the company. And so Tom let me know that was coming, and I cut my paternity leave a little short because I didn't want to miss that.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. We actually kind of put the effort, because we had been talking about doing a book. I think Ted just called me one day, and I was like, "Hey, Ted, what's going on?" And he was like, "Do you want to write a book?" And I was like, "What?" Like, oh, okay. But it sort of was a very obvious thing to do in a lot of ways. I think people were constantly asking us what happened.
Yeah.
And there was no article that we could point to that really explained what happened. It took something more. So it just seemed like something we should do. And that's, it didn't write itself, but it was just a very clear path as to how to do it.
I found the book fascinating. I couldn't put it down after I opened the covers. And so there are many quotes from Jack Welch. And I remember one about he gave himself an A or an A plus on his chiefdom, and he gave himself an F on the selection of Immelt. But that's far too simplistic, isn't it?
Yes.
Your thoughts on that?
Well,
You?
That idea suggests that someone other than Immelt would have been able to continue what Jack had done. And
Right.
and I think, no one could continue what Jack had done. The world changed pretty quickly after Immelt came in. I think even early on with 9/11 and Enron, like those things alone made it very difficult for Jeff to run GE the way Jack did. I mean, he tried. He tried to keep making that mythology work, but I think Jack, as far as giving himself an A, I don't, but I don't think the choice of succession. I don't think the idea that if only he had chosen someone different, that it would have been
Any different?
Yeah, I mean, there might have been a slightly different trajectory, but I think it ultimately ends up in the same place.
Yeah. Ted?
Yeah, I agree with Tom. Even when I was starting on the beat, there was a little bit of truth to both of those things. There was much about the company when Welch was stepping away from it that was not going to be sustainable, and some of that was just cyclical stuff in the business. For a friend and I were talking the other day about this, and you just look at the turbine sales at the end of the 90s. Like there was so much that even in the course of what they were actually doing as an industrial company, that was going to have to be managed and was not going to be easy. And so I do think that the Immelt critics have often acted as if he really steered the ship off course when there was going to have to be a lot of change from the very moment he took control. And then it's also true that he overpaid for a lot of deals. He grew GE Capital to its largest size. It was biggest under Jeff, not under Jack. And he made some strategic errors, which I think, everyone would now admit. But it is way too simplistic to just suggest that he had it made and just simply screwed it up. I think what Tom said is right. Like they could have given the reins to some of the other contenders, and we would have had a different version of the same thing.
Fascinating.
Yeah, I think because of what Welch built, you couldn't do something drastic with GE, especially right after Welch retired. Like you couldn't have broken up the company. You could not have brought an outsider in to run it. Like the GE's role in society, economy, the perception of the stock market, like that would have been insanity. Like, why would you have destroyed something like that? In some ways, the way it came apart, it only could come apart in the way it did over a long period of time. But I think Ted makes a great point that like Jeff made some very questionable decisions, and he stuck with some things that he probably shouldn't have stuck with way too long.
Sure. And there was also something, I mean, this was the era of Enron as well, correct? And Enron happened around that period of time, and something called Sarbanes-Oxley was enacted into law, which really tightened up accounting rules. And some of the stuff that perhaps GE, some of the liberties they were taking was no longer kosher. Would that be a correct assumption?
Yeah, I think it's very fair to say that which is, to be clear, not saying they were taking the liberties that Enron was, but there were changes.
Correct.
Sure, no, I know, but the fact that just the simple fact that they had to make changes to their own accounting and their own structures based on the rule changes that followed Enron suggests that there was a sort of a general laxity that they had to correct.
What do you think Immelt could have done different?
Tom?
I mean, it's a loaded question.
Yeah.
But, I mean, and Monday morning quarterbacking is very easy, but
it definitely is. I mean, I think in some ways, for him to be like Jack, he had to be less like Jack. Like he probably should have jettisoned some businesses. He probably needed to rethink. Welch had such a business sense, and he knew everything that was going on inside of those operations. And Jeff probably could have used more of that and less reliance on marketing and sales and the idea that like we just need to convince people that GE is great.
We just need to polish this.
Right. Like his view throughout his tenure was like, people don't get it. Right. Like people don't get what we're doing. And like, that's not really like, if people don't get it, like you might not be doing the right thing,
Right.
Like I don't think Jeff could see it that way. Like he instantly embraced the idea of, I'm the CEO of GE, one of the greatest CEOs in the world. Like I'm one of the powerful, and therefore what I do is correct. And it was, that sort of exceptionalism. I think he needed to step back and reassess that. But
Yeah, I think didn't mean to cut you off, Tom. I'm sorry.
No, you did.
I feel like from our vantage point too, being reporters dealing with this company, which is obsessed with controlling the narrative and obsessed with its own image, like even by the standards of corporate PR, was really interesting. And we would get browbeaten by them about, how come you don't write about Jeff like you write about tech CEOs? Like, why don't you write about GE as a tech company? They eventually bullied the New York Times and a couple other outlets into referring to GE as a 124-year-old startup, it's ridiculous, like totally absurd. So much of the approach was, if you would just talk about us the way we're asking you to, the people whose votes really matter to us, Wall Street investors, will treat us the way we deserve to be treated and will value us the way we want to be valued. So I agree with Tom that there was a lot of focus on this notion that people just weren't, the people they cared about were not sort of seeing the genius that they felt that the company had, was providing. And then there were strategic errors that get pointed out from time to time by, again, these are critics of Immelt, so it's not like it's one-sided, but there are people who would say that the term fad surfing came up a lot. They would get fascinated by something new and chase into a new sector. Look at their experience in oil and gas. Like, there's building up this entirely new industrial segment of the company, basically coming in late and overpaying for almost everything and eventually retreating from it. And that's an example where I feel like his strategic decisions are criticized before you even get to something like Alstom. But I agree with Tom that it's more of this sort of fundamental belief that outside entities should view the company as something slightly different than what it was. Like, you didn't hear Honeywell telling you we ought to be written about as a tech company.
Right. What about the role of the board? I was, as a chap who sits on a couple of boards, and that's something that I do, I was fascinated by the coziness and the, dare I say, ineffectiveness of the GE board. What happened there? Was that also pride and delusion, or what? Because they certainly were not questioning very hard the moves.
Yeah, I think that that is a legacy of Jack. That was something that under Jack, in his rise and his success, he built the board around himself, and there was not a lot of questioning as far as Jack's decisions and what he wanted to do. And GE was just so successful and so iconic that it's hard for us to think about that time, right? And I think it's hard to imagine the board doing anything but conceding to Jack. I mean, it's just like, he was so successful. I mean, it was like, why wouldn't you let what they perceive as this brilliant man running this business in a brand new way, why wouldn't you let him do what he needs to do, and just kind of sit back and watch? And that included the succession process. I mean, he really handpicked Immelt, and I think because of that, Jeff saw himself as like the true successor, and that like the board should just not question him, and he built the board around himself. And I think the culture of the GE board was like, that's what you do. GE is run by the chairman, and it's not the board, which is, you talked about Sarbanes-Oxley, like that's a bad idea. Like, you need good corporate governance, you need transparency. And I think that was something that didn't shift until very late in Jeff's career.
Yeah, Tom said it all. He controlled the board, not the other way around.
Yep.
And these were smart people on that board. They were not, in many cases they had sort of, talking about the complexity of the company. They could point to board members who had experience in oil and gas to say, look, we're covered because we have this expertise in the meeting. Or they could point to, folks who are in banking and folks who are in advertising. And so it was a diverse set of people with real resumes, real skills, real experience. And so from the outside, yeah, it looked like what we're told a corporate board is supposed to be. It's like a really good collection of advisors who could advise the CEO and help him avoid making bad decisions. But in practice, that's just not how it worked at all. It was a cozy sinecure for these folks. And Immelt is a really smart and charming guy. I think that gets left out of the coverage. Like, he's very convincing.
Yeah.
But it's also the case that we, in all of our reporting, it was very clear that it was his way or the highway on these big decisions, and that board was not stepping up to him at all.
Was the subtitle Pride, Delusion, and the Fall of General Electric, was the pride and delusion attributable to Jack Welch as well? Because when you first see or when I first saw the book and bought it, I immediately went to the post Jack Welch era, or my mind did. And as I read the book, you become educated that not so quickly, not so fast. It's not that. It's like the question I began with: is it unfair to say that Jack was all victory and Jeff was all loss? So was Pride and Delusion part of Welch as well, and that era?
Simple answer is yes. I think there's a through line of hubris that runs through the company under Welch and under Immelt. And it's as simple as one of the things that they used to say they would say it about themselves, and people would say it about them, whenever we called. There was this belief at GE that you learned how to manage, and a person who had risen in the ranks in GE could manage anything. That is absolutely how they carried themselves, and that's hubris. And no one's system is that good.
I agree with that. I think a lot of that comes from Welch. Like I think of some of the deals. The RCA deal really always strikes me from Welch. Mid '80s, buying a media company. Acquiring NBC, General Electric, an industrial company. I mean, if Ford Motor bought a social media company today or something, whatever the equivalent is today, investors would be outraged. But Jack could sort of spin that, and I think that delusion, I think of that that something inside GE is more valuable than outside of it, that GE just simply could run anything better. That delusion carried over from Jack to Jeff, but you can't, given the length that Jeff was CEO and given the way the world had shifted, you cannot simply point to Jack and say, this was on Jack, because it wasn't. And the CEO of General Electric, in a lot of ways, should know better. Mm-hmm. I think Jeff wasn't comfortable with GE Capital. Even when GE Capital was even shortly after he took over, and there were problems because of disclosure and having, how they dealt with GE Capital. And then after the financial crisis, Jeff was slow to actually make the decision to get out of capital when GE probably should have gotten out of capital a long time ago. Mm-hmm. What business do they have as an industrial company being a massive bank? It just didn't make sense. So, I think it does pass over from Jack, but you cannot just put it on Jack. I don't, in some ways I do think, and not to give Jack a pass, but, in some ways, like, Jack was a product of his time.
Mm-hmm. Tom said it well. There, for all of the flaws, that he inherited, Jeff owns his significant tenure at the wheel.
Did either of you read Hot Seat?
I did.
And what's your view?
Every man is entitled to his own opinion. And,
right.
That was Jeff telling Jeff's version of the story.
Right. Tom?
Yeah, I think, yes, I did. And I think Ted and I had heard pretty much everything in hot seat many times, including from Jeff. You know, I mean, Jeff was, you know, Ted and I had spent a significant amount of time with Jeff, and heard his take on things, and we were very familiar with it. And he has his version of the world.
So you got to know him fairly well.
I don't know if I would say that, but we got to spend some time with him. You know,
Right.
I think,
Right.
you know, I think we got a pretty good feel for Jeff.
Authors sometimes can get attached to a subject or a person, if you will. If you're writing a biography. Now, you weren't far from writing a biography of Jeff Immelt. But I remember a friend of mine saying that he thought Isaacson had become too attached to Steve Jobs because he interviewed Jobs when Jobs was alive. He wrote the book when Jobs was alive and perhaps was influenced by his charm. I don't know if that's fair or not, but anything at play there? You weren't seduced by the subject?
You read the book, right?
Yeah.
I don't think so. I don't think so.
That's true. That's true. You did write the book.
We spent some time with Jeff, but it wasn't, you know, we weren't walking along the beach with Jeff. And spent some time with Jack as well. And, you know, it was good to speak with those men, but, no, I don't think that was an issue.
Tell me a little bit about Jack Welch's departure. And, you know, he was quiet for a while, but all hell broke loose, right? Talk a little bit about that. And was he fair to his predecessor?
That's a tough question. Yeah, he was quiet. He did, he did sort of stand on the sidelines for a while. And when finally, things were really rough, and it was 2008. Correct me if I'm wrong, but and they had a really bad earnings miss, and Jack went on CNBC as he does. You know, he CNBC was his baby. He loved going on there, and they adored him. And he blasted Jeff, and I mean, he blasted Jeff as if he was the CEO of some other company, and I think, Ted, you may have to pick this up. I think he said he would shoot him if he missed his.
He did. That's in Hot Seat. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, I mean, really, just like no question. It's disapproval.
Yeah. Just make your numbers.
Right.
Yes. Which was easier in old GE, right? I mean,
correct.
Yeah, and then he did sort of go quiet again, and by the time the wheels were really coming off, I think he was in a somewhat more private setting, was being pretty blunt about how badly he felt they had bungled everything. But yeah, that CNBC moment was the peak, I feel like, at least for the general public.
Interesting. So, and what about GE today? Have you kept up with it?
somewhat.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it's GE is
It's a shadow of its former self.
Well, it's funny because I was looking up something about General Electric, and I typed in General Electric, and before I could keep typing, I hit enter, and the Google AI summary of General Electric came up, and it's in the past.
Mm-hmm.
It's GE was a multinational industrial conglomerate.
Right.
And I think that's GE is in the past.
Correct.
It's now the pieces. You've got Vernova, its power, and then aviation, which is really the main GE survival, and healthcare, which is kind of, you could argue, should have happened a long time ago. It is the model that John Flannery really laid out when he took over for Jeff Immelt, and Larry Culp ultimately came in to execute. And I think that is what GE ultimately needed to be broken up by an outsider. It was not going to be a GE man who was going to make those moves.
Yeah, wouldn't have had the emotional attachment, if you will. Correct?
Yeah, definitely.
And Immelt's departure, tell me a little bit about that. Did he jump off the tracks before the train came, or?
I remember where I was. I was driving across Iceland with no cell phone signal.
Wow.
And I got to the airport and I had like 1,000 emails or something. But yeah, Tom, what do you think? That day it was like a surprise, but a long time coming. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Yeah.
As a friend of mine would say, I was shocked but not surprised.
Yeah, I think that's, I think Jeff was, in some ways, was coming apart at the seams. Like he really, he had this meltdown at this financial conference where he just was like, we're sticking with our numbers, we're sticking with people who are like, how? And he basically was like, if we wanted to cut him, we'd cut him. And it was like, just, there was no confidence
Right.
in Jeff anymore. And his old lines about, Alstom was working and GE Digital was the future, all of these, just people were like, this is not the growth that is needed at GE or the change that is needed. He was, they had an activist involved. I mean, he probably could have stepped down earlier, and saved some face. And I think he waited until he sort of had to go.
Yep. Yeah. So, gentlemen, a couple of questions for a couple of learning points, since this is heart to heart on leadership. What is the message for corporate boards today? What can they glean from lights out, pride, delusion, and the fall of General Electric? What's the message for corporate boards?
I mean, the simplest message is this board needed to be much more involved and it needed to be much more comfortable challenging and checking the chief executive.
Correct.
Simple as that.
Correct.
And they needed to be more skeptical of the narrative, of the story, as one of the GE executives like to say, that the story was strategy. No, that's not a strategy. They needed to be much more, the board needed to be much more proactive and skeptical and challenging and, not oppositional to the CEO, but, there's a lot of this stuff that clearly needed to have been hashed out and in some cases discarded, and they didn't do any of that.
Tom?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, making sure you have experts on the board that really understand the businesses and can ask hard questions. I think making sure the board turnover is in check. You don't have directors sitting on the board for
Forever.
too long. Also, like a big thing for me is don't have the CEO be the chairman.
Correct.
I think that's a very basic thing that companies can do to really improve corporate governance and really have a strong independent chairman. And to Ted's point, you don't have to be oppositional to the CEO, but like a little bit of that probably is healthy. Like that is the role of the board.
Yes. Yes.
you know?
I
So,
fundamentally believe that there has to be in the boardroom a bit of tension, if you will, a bit of tension,
that makes sense to me. There's a lot at stake, you
a
know?
lot at stake.
Especially these giant companies with so many investors and retirees, and you know, it's not a game. And I think it was at certain points at GE.
And you still see a lot of resistance to the concept of board and chair being separate, right? JP Morgan, Jamie Dimon,
Yep.
you know,
It's
the
interesting. There's always that exception, right? There's always that, you know, oh, but Jamie Dimon, I mean, come on, he's right. Like, you know,
right,
how could he do any wrong? And it's like, well,
right.
until he does, you know, and that's the whole point. You know, it's why we need good governance.
And what about the message then for corporate leadership? You know, young and up and coming, and others, even long of tooth in corporate leadership. What's the message here?
A thing I noticed was that GE executives, really high-ranking ones, really did seem to believe that they were hearing dissent, that they heard disagreement when it occurred, and it just wasn't true. And it wasn't true in that, you know, people were discouraged from, you know, arguing against something that everyone knew the CEO or the CEO of Power wanted to do. And I do think that they believed that there was more of a free flow of opinion and judgment and a broader discussion that was actually occurring. I remember when we were fact checking, talking to someone who was a very high ranking executive about the Alstom deal and talking about people inside the business unit of the power business who just thought this thing was insane, and they were going into the entire deal backwards. Backwards from a price to make a French investor whole, rather than like buying what was essentially a failing company for a song, which is what they should have been doing. And the executive I was talking to said, we quote this in, I think, the introduction maybe, said, look, if someone down on F deck had this feeling, well, you know, they ought to have raised their hand. And that attitude is just incredible if you think about the way that they thought their management system worked. Like, first of all, to speak so derisively about someone in the unit that is about to spend all this money on a company, but also they, you know, we write about that person in the book. People were trying to raise their hands saying, this is the opposite of the idea. What are we doing here? And that was actively discouraged. And, you know, eventually you will have employees who just say, okay, well, you know, I'm going to get paid this year and I can't afford to lose this job. I got a kid who's I'm in college. And so I do feel like they were wrong about how much information they were getting from their own people. And if they had it to do again, I think they probably would have wanted to hear more dissent and to have it inform some of these decisions. In that case, one that was a disaster that they had people inside the company arguing against, and they didn't listen.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. I think for, you know, leadership, as far as just paying attention to fundamentals, you know, I think GE got so far away from that, you know, thinking about deals, as Ted mentioned, thinking about deals as a, you know, what's right at one price is wrong at another price. You know, you don't just do the deal no matter what. You think about all the stock GE bought back. Like, you've got to think about capital. You've got to think about it in a clear way, in the sense of, like, is this the way we want to deploy the money we have? Does it make sense to buy these shares at this price? Not get away from the marketing and the sales aspect and the image and the brand to drive the value of the company, because that's not where the value of the company is. And I think, like, Jack, you know, you can question things that he did, but I think he really did understand that. Like, he really did understand the fundamentals of the business and what it needed and what it didn't need and how you have to make your numbers. And, you know, he wasn't an MBA, you know, that wasn't
Right.
Jack. Like, he operated like he was, and but he was a chemical engineer.
Right.
And that was I think Jeff couldn't get away from his salesman past. And he needed more sort of fundamental how to run a business, almost business school, capital markets sort of thinking. And I think that is what is demanded more now. And I do think that is what John Flannery and Larry Culp did bring to GE.
Yes, on both counts.
Yeah. That sort of nuts and bolts, let's get back to it and cut away the BS kind of thing.
So, gentlemen, final question for me. This is a university, and the product is the output of mostly young men and women who are about to embark upon their careers. And what advice would you have for them in terms of the forward trail and leadership? What can our students at Sacred Heart and across the land get out of Lights Out, Pride, Delusion, and the fall of GE? What advice would you have?
I was going to say subscribe to newspapers, but that's probably not
digital or other.
Yeah. Any way you can.
Yeah.
I don't have any really wise advice. I think there are well-intentioned people all through this story.
Yes.
And there are lots of instances of kind of related to what Tom was just saying, not wanting to deal with the entirety of the problem that's directly in front of you. I think of someone I spoke to who said he compared GE Capital staff to the Marines in the way they run toward problems, but then also said in the next breath, the problem is everyone wants to solve the problem in the short term and move on from it, and the cause of it often remained. And I do think that one of the lessons here is that there were fundamental problems to solve just woven through this company, and no one had enough of an incentive to address them or to admit their depth. And so I think, the good leaders, like Tom was just saying about John Flannery and about Culp, I mean, they had to say the hard thing and confront the difficult reality, and that basically is what it all boils down to.
Mm-hmm. Tom?
Yeah, I think that's well said. I think, read your history, be aware of what's happened in the past, but also be aware of the world around you, because it's changing so fast. And, and I think also when we think about Jeff and then what happened after Jeff, I think, talk to people. Talk to trusted advisors and listen, be open-minded. These are the ways that you're going to lead in a changing world. You are very unlikely to be able to have the answers yourself. And just be open to the idea that you may be wrong. And there are different ways of doing things. I think if GE had a little bit more of that, it may have ended differently. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, if we're talking about General Electric breaking up into different pieces, I'm not sure there's any way that could have happened in a painless manner. I think it always was going to be a mess. It was always going to be emotionally distraught. It just was how it had to happen.
There was no easy way out.
Exactly.
Right.
Now, it was the fall of an empire, right?
Yeah, the fall of an empire, exactly. I thank you both for this tremendous discussion and the lessons to be learned from Lights Out, Pride, Delusion, and the fall of General Electric. I found it a fascinating read. I couldn't put it down. You're getting this podcast from Sacred Heart University, Heart to Heart on Leadership. And I sincerely thank Ted Mann and Tom Gryta for today. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thanks, Chuck.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for joining us. Stay tuned for more conversations on the Heart to Heart podcasts on leadership.